Good afternoon. Oh, sounds beautiful. Welcome to this third lecture in the series History of Svalbard. Yes, here we go. Whaling and sealing in the 17th and 18th century. I'm bound to tell you that this lecture and the future lectures are going to be recorded, and they will be available on a YouTube playlist that can be accessed via some very secret roads on the UNIS website. For those of you who are UNIS students, you will find also the recordings and an instruction on how to access them on Canvas. Perhaps you have noticed. I've just made some small tests and it seems to work, but I'm not quite sure. So I'll be very pleased if you test that out and give me a notice if it doesn't work. Were there any questions regarding yesterday's lecture, perhaps? No? Things disappear on screen. This is very disturbing. Why does this happen? I don't know. There we go again. Is this the magic? No. Right. Today I'm going to talk about, in the first half, I'm going to talk about the development of Arctic whaling, ask questions about why this business started in the first place, the markets and the motives, the roots of Arctic whaling, how it developed, and change, technology shift in this phase. Then in the second half, we're going to talk about how this business expanded in the latter half of the 17th century and became an activity in the whole northern Atlantic and even west of Greenland as well, expanded enormously. And it also changed technology in the sense that the land stations that were used in the beginning, they were left and they continued the activity in open sea and near the drifting ice. I'll talk a little bit about sealing as well in the West Ice, and we'll ask the question whether this was a sustainable resource exploitation. Why and how did this industry develop is the general problem that we will be discussing, and also what were the impacts on Svalbard. What were the impacts of this harvesting of biological resources? So, but we start out naturally with today's cultural heritage quiz. This is also an object from Svalbard Museum. Perhaps some of you have visited the museum and you've seen examples of this. Anyway, no large premium today, too. You can think about it and make bets amongst yourselves, of course. But the solution will come at the end of the lecture, as usual. And it has something to do with today's lecture, of course. Okay, the roots of Arctic whaling. Why did this whaling start in the first place? Well, there is a law called Say's law that if you have an offer, they will create a demand. If you have a supply of something, that supply will create its own demand. In this case, there was a demand for, in general, for oils and fats in a growing urban population in Europe. I'm sure you heard about the Black Plague, the Black Svartedauden. in the 1350s. It killed off perhaps half of Europe's population, and Europe's population was growing in the 16th and 17th centuries. People moved into cities and towns, they were urbanized, they moved indoors, they needed lighting in their houses. They needed oils and fats for the purposes that we use oils and fats today, except that we use oil in motor cars and things like that. They obviously didn't have engines, but for all other purposes, as lubrication, for lighting, or for making soap, or whatever, you needed oils and fats. Now, oils and fats can be begotten from various sources. You can grow crops and produce oil. You all know about rapeseed oil, or soy oil, or olive oil. It's in principle, it's the same thing. It's oil used for roughly the same purposes. What we're talking about here is, of course, animal fats, animal oil, that competed with other kinds of oil. Now, when the population was growing, it made more sense for farmers to use their lands to produce other edible goods like wheat or flour, or grow vegetables and things like that, than to produce oil, because it takes a lot of area. So that is how animal, or either oil from cod liver, for instance, which was a big export article from Norway ever since the Middle Ages, or indeed whale oil. But where did they get the whale oil from? There weren't many whalers in Europe at that time. But there was one group of people, the Basques, people living in the area in the south of the Bay of Biscay, in the border area between today's France and Spain. That's the Basque area. They had a tradition ever since the Middle Ages to hunt for big whales in the Bay of Biscay, and developing a technology by using small boats rowing out in the open sea, using harpoons. Harpoon is a Basque word, by the way, and a lot of the expressions in whaling stem from this Basque activity. Killing the whale and produce oil. They also ate the meat of the whale, but that was not a commercial product. But the oil was. So these were the only people who had an open sea whaling culture. Whales were exploited also elsewhere in Europe in the Middle Ages. For instance, in Norway, and if there was a dead whale that drifted ashore, the whale was, of course, exploited. Smaller whales were killed in bays and fjords in Norway and the Faroe Islands. On Iceland, they even killed bigger whales using perhaps poison and spears and bows and arrows that were poisoned. But this was not a commercial activity. The Basques whaling, they sold the produce, so that was a commercial activity. They sold the products, not for subsistence whaling. We talked about yesterday the search for the northwest sea route that started in the end of the 15th century, the 1490s. Very soon after the first exploratory expeditions had gone to Labrador and the Hudson Bay area, fishermen followed in the wake of the explorers. Because when they came back, these exploring expeditions, they told about rich, very rich stocks of particularly cod on the banks of Newfoundland, and also whales. And at this point in time, whale oils and whale oil was getting scarce in Europe. So these Basque whalers, they followed in the wake, literally followed in the wake of the fishermen from England and France, crossing the Atlantic and establishing whaling in the area between Labrador and Newfoundland, in an area particularly concentrated in an area called the Red Bay, which is in the Belle Isle Strait between Labrador and Newfoundland on the coast of present-day Canada. So from the 1520s on, they built up quite a large industry there, catching big whales, Arctic whales, bowhead whales, North Capers, producing oil, which was then exported back to Europe and sold in Europe. And every other year, hundreds of tons of oil would be imported into Europe. But they also overtaxed these stocks of whales that were in that region. So towards the end of the century, there was a decrease in whale oil imports to Europe. So the Basques began searching for other hunting grounds. They went to Iceland, we know, and they also went to northern Norway. And in fact, did whaling in northern Norway. There are lots of place names in northern Norway that are connected with whale, Kvaløya, Kvalsund, things like that, and also are associated with the boiling of whale oil. Kjelsund, for instance. But although there were whales here, they were also in competition with others, particularly the King of Denmark and Norway was not happy having Basque whalers in his waters that he claimed sovereignty over. So this did not expand to a big activity. But then we know, of course, now that things changed around 1600 because Svalbard was discovered. In 1596, Svalbard was discovered. For the first few years, nobody followed in the wake of Jan Cornelis Reip and Willem Barents. But in the beginning of the 1600s, the British sent expedition, Hudson, for instance, and Jonas Poole went to Bjørnøya, Bear Island, and Spitsbergen in the beginning of the 1600s. They came back and reported of huge quantities of whales in the seas around Spitsbergen, and also walruses and seals. Lots of resources that could be had. Now, this also was attractive for the Basques, of course, who were the expert whalers. The British, the Dutch, the French, the Germans, they did not have that technology. So what they did was, of course, to approach the Basques and hire Basque experts on board the first expeditions. The main prey that they were looking for was this guy here, a substantial animal, the bowhead whale, also called the Greenland whale, Balena mysticetus in Latin. It is an Arctic species, which means it has his or her, its life cycle is in Arctic waters. They have their, they don't migrate. They're not a global species, as opposed to many other whale species who migrate all over the world, or can be found both in the north and south, in boreal waters and in Arctic waters. This is an Arctic species, it lives in the Arctic, and it is counted among the baleen whales. You know what a baleen whale is? A bardeval in Norwegian. It, as opposed to tooth whales, it doesn't have teeth. Instead, it has barder, which is these baleen, long, it's like a sift, a big sift in the mouth, and seal, where it just, when it feeds, it just rolls through the sea with its mouth open. And when it's, at some point, it closes its mouth and uses its enormous tongue to press out the water between these baleen, this sift, and all the goodies are trapped behind. And then it just, and it has a mouthful, just like that. Pinner whales, the same thing, also a baleen whale. It's also called a right whale. Right whale. There are different or various species of right whales. This is a right whale. And it was called so because it was the right whale to catch. That's why it's called the right whale. So there's no left whale or wrong whale. It's only right whale. You will notice Greenland whales or bowhead whales have been observed lately also in Svalbard. I've never seen them. And I wrote my doctoral thesis about them, but I've never seen one in real life. But if you should spot whales here, and if you go out on sea in summer, you will see whales. How do you recognize a bowhead whale? Well, the best thing to see is when it goes in the water, it doesn't have a dorsal fin. It doesn't have a dorsal fin on its back. All the other whales have smaller or larger dorsal fins. This one doesn't. Why? Evolution is clever because it operates often under ice. So a dorsal fin would be in the way. That was a digression. It has nothing relevant, no relevance for what we're talking about. But you can imagine its size, 18 to 20 meters, quite substantial, about the size of a bus. 100 tons, a grown animal, substantially more than a bus. So using manual methods, killing these animals required some courage and some expertise, you can imagine. It was an ideal prey for the whalers in the sense that this animal is exceedingly fat. Because it is an Arctic species, it layers fat on its body to insulation and, of course, for storing energy. It's just like you, when you have spent half a year or so in Svalbard, you accumulate a lot of fat. I don't. I live on the mainland, so I don't keep it. I just use fat. It's ideal in the sense that this fat animal, when it's killed, it floats. As opposed to many other leaner whales that when they are killed, they will sink. So in order to catch these leaner whales like finner whales or blue whales or whatever, you need a big ship and a very strong wire or rope to keep it floating. Or they would often also pump air into the dead whales to keep them afloat so they could process them. But this guy here floats when it's killed. So it could be maneuvered on to the shore and processed, or floating, kept floating by the side of the ship. It's also ideal in the sense that because it's an Arctic species, it moves very slowly, like all of us do in Svalbard. Again, not to use too much energy. To conserve energy, you don't want to move more than necessary. Oh, it's fast enough because it's a huge animal. But it's possible to get quite close to these, or at least it was possible to get quite close to it. And the whalers had to get close in order to harpoon it. As far as we know, there were two separate populations in the Atlantic region. There was this North Atlantic population, probably the largest, the red marked in red on the sketch map here, and there was also probably a separate population in the Davis Strait west of Greenland. Both of these populations were hunted, severely hunted, but the start of the business was with the Northern Atlantic population. Now the whales, they winter south of Greenland in the Cape, or they used to winter when they were numerous in the areas between Labrador and Greenland, south of Cape Farewell. And in the spring, they would migrate northwards, following the melting ice edge, feeding as they went north. You know, the blooming of all the phyto and zooplankton. In the spring, as the sun comes back, they will be feeding along the roughly eastern coast of Greenland, ending up in Svalbard in the midsummer, where they would be hunted. And then in the autumn, they would go south again. In general, only blubber was exploited, as well as the baleen. The blubber was boiled down to oil that was sold as a product, train oil. And the baleen was used for various other purposes. It's the same substance as nails and hair. So it's very flexible and very strong. If you go into the museum, you can see an example. This could be 3 meter long, these baleen plates. And they could be used for purposes that you would today use plastic or carbon fiber or something like that, because it's strong, light, and flexible. It was also used for producing luxury products. One thing that is often mentioned, that this was used for producing corsets for ladies, and also for producing umbrellas and parasols and things like that. So it had its value. It worked. They used it to secure the baleen. But although this animal is very fat, approximately 20% of the animal is fat. Not all of that could be exploited, but when you have an animal of 100 ton and perhaps you get 10, 15, even 20 tons of fat, it's quite a lot. But it's also a lot of meat that was not used, because there was no tradition in Europe, on the European continent, save for the Basques, to eat whale meat. Why do you think? I've been raised on whale meat. In the 1960s, you know, that was the cheapest meat you could get. So a lot of Norwegians ate whale meat. They didn't do that on the European continent, probably for religious reason. The whale hunt was called the whale fishery. This was considered a fish. Yes, a very large fish, but still a fish. But it had red meat, bloody meat. Fish was not supposed to have red, bloody meat. It was supposed to have white. So this was a more or less banned in many religious circles. That it was supposed to be unclean to eat meat. Scandinavians ate whale meat. They still do. But the French and the Germans and the British did not. So think about that. All that meat that was left rotting on Svalbard, they only brought the baleen and the train oil with them. It must have been bonanza for gulls and polar foxes and polar bears and things like that. We'll come back to that later. There are so many buttons here, I keep pushing the wrong ones. Right. Yes. The company period. It's so called. Now, let's see if you remember anything from yesterday. The exploitation of the biological resources in this region, in the Svalbard region, Bjørnøya, Spitsbergen, the waters around, started early, and that was the British. In 1604, a British expedition landed on Bjørnøya to hunt walruses. They found there were hundreds, perhaps thousands of walruses resting on Bjørnøya in those waters. Now, why would the British go to Bjørnøya to hunt for walruses, when the British did not normally hunt walruses? Think about that for a while, and then I'll give you the answer. Or the possible answer is that they were well acquainted with walrus products because they had been, as all of you remember, been trading in the White Sea with Archangels since the 1550s. And the Russians, the Pomoers, they caught walruses. So walrus was a well-known product. So that when, after the discovery of Svalbard had been made, or Spitsbergen had been made in 1596, and the British sent expeditions, they also saw that there were walruses here. Well, they knew that animal from the trade activity in the White Sea. So they decided to hunt for them. The first year was not very successful. The next year they slaughtered hundreds of walruses and probably more or less scared all the walruses away from Bjørnøya. Whaling, that was a little more complicated, or it required a little more expertise. They didn't have that expertise. So what did they do, the British? Well, they sent people down to Saint-Jean-de-Luz, other towns and small cities in the Bay of Biscay, where the Basques whalers lived, and recruited them for good money on board the British ships. Also, the Dutch had some Basque experts on board when they started in 1613. So it was the Basques who taught the British, and indirectly then the Dutch and everybody else that came later, how to catch whales, big whales in the more or less open sea. This first decades, 4-5 decades, until, let's say, the 1640s, was called the company period. And it's so called because this was a restricted activity. The British organized themselves in the company I mentioned yesterday, namely the Muscovy Company, you remember, Richard Chancellor, who signed a treaty with the Russian Tsar, and they formed a company for trading with the Russians. This was called the Muscovy Company. That was the British one. That company acquired privileges, rights, sovereign rights from the British king. That was normal in those days, that in principle, all resources were owned by the king. So in order to exploit those resources, whether there were minerals or wood or game in the woods or whatever, it belonged to the king. So the king had to allow for harvesting those resources. So the British king said that, well, if you want to do harvesting here, you need privileges. So the Muscovy Company got those privileges. And then they were able, more or less, in theory at least, to exclude others, at least in in Britain from taking part in the whaling. Now, they had no jurisdiction, of course, on Svalbard. That is something we're going to talk about in a special lecture about the political history here. But they had certainly no jurisdiction over the Dutch. So they couldn't exclude the Dutch. The Dutch also organized themselves in a sort of a company. It was called the Nordic Company, the Nordic Company. It wasn't really a company like the Muscovy Company. It was more like a cartel. It was more like Dutch cities and merchants joining together and cooperating, keeping others out of that, but cooperating. It was not one united company with a unified leadership. It was rather a group of cooperating merchant cities. So these two companies, they were formed to keep competition out. That also meant that the number of whaling ships and whalers on Svalbard in that period was restricted. And so also the taxation of the resources was restricted. And that was probably a good thing. Until 1618, there were rivalry and conflicts, often, or not often, but sometimes resorting even to violence in the first years of the hunt between the British and the Dutch, first and foremost. Also, some Basques were involved in the conflicts. In 1618, the commanders of the two fleets, the British and the Dutch, met in Belsen, I think it was, actually, down here, at the end of the season, and made an agreement that said, let's more or less do our business in separate areas. So they more or less divided, particularly the west coast of Spitsbergen, between themselves, so that the Dutch whalers, who at that time were becoming the most numerous, they concentrated on the northwestern region of Spitsbergen, whereas the British, they established their stations along the west coast of Spitsbergen from Magdalenefjorden and southwards. There were also some stations in Edgeo. All the others that came later into the whaling business, they had to make do with other places for the first time, because the best harbors and the best places for land stations were already taken by the Dutch and the British. So that was a point of conflict for some time. In some of the literature, you will read about something that amounted to wars between British and Dutch on Svalbard. It's totally exaggerated. There were conflicts over the hand and the occasional sinking of a ship, but no such thing as a war. Later in the development, during this land station-based activity, also other nations took part. There were Spanish whalers here, there were French whalers, Danish, Norwegian whalers as well. And from the 1640s, 50s, also German whalers took part in the activity. So it was an international business, and a rather extensive one as well. The technology that was used is, in some sense, brutal and disgusting. On the other hand, it is impressive in the sense that these were manual methods, and the effectiveness with which they were able to kill off more than 100,000 whales is in a perverse way quite impressive. As I said, this was Basque technology. They used these slender boats, rowing boats. They had a mothership a sailing ship, square-rigged sailing ship, perhaps 200 tons, not very big, with a crew of typically 40 people on board. And they were manned with 2 or 3 or even 4 whaling boats, these small, slender rowing boats, rowed by normally 4 people, 1 person sitting behind and steering the boat, and at the front of the boat, in the bow of the boat, was the harpooner. So they would, when they saw a whale that was blowing, was up breathing, that is, they tried to approach the whale, get as close as possible, because these harpoons that they used, they were heavy. If you go into Svalbard Museum, you can see samples of such harpoons. The harpoon itself is a spear this long of iron or steel, and to that spear is attached a wooden handle. Altogether, it weighs 12, 15 kilos, so you can't throw it very far. So you need to get very close to the whale. To this iron, the harpoon itself, was attached a slender but very strong line, a thin line, which again was attached to rope, thick ship rope that was coiled in casks on board the whaling boat. You see the casks on the ship there. So when the whale was struck with a harpoon, the harpoon was thrown into the whale on a distance of perhaps 10 meters or so. It dove into the sea, went under, and it could be under for 15, 20 minutes, the whale. And all the time it was dragging this heavy rope after it. Gradually, the whale became exhausted, and it had to come, it's a mammal, it had to surface to breathe. All the while, the boat had to steer behind the whale and make sure that the whale didn't surface on the other side of an ice floe, for instance. In that case, they needed to just cut the rope in order not to be dragged under. The greatest danger was, of course, to be hit by the tail. That was, in fact, the only weapon, as it were, the whale had, but also very forceful. It could, of course, smash a boat with one blow of the tail. This could go on for hours while the whale was tired out, and eventually they would approach the whale, get closer to the whale, and then it would be stabbed to death by spears, long spears, standing in the boat, and just bled the whale to death. It was quite brutal, bloody business, and it could go on for hours until the whale was killed. When it was finally killed, as I said, it floated, luckily. So they had land stations for processing. So they towed the whale back to shore, the closer where the land station was. They didn't drag this whole whale on to the shore. Instead, it was left floating on the beach. And then it was peeled, much like an orange, a very large orange, a grapefruit, perhaps, or even greater than that. They would rotate. They would cut long strips of blubber from the whale and have a rope and a hook in it and drag it up while they were cutting long strips of rope, rotating the whale as they did that. It was left floating on near the beach. So it was flensed, as it is called, there. Then they stripped the blubber off and cut it into smaller pieces on land. And then they brought these small pieces onto casks that they had prepared that was on fireplaces, heated cask. And you don't need a lot of heat to melt the blubber into oil. It melts well below 100 degrees. but you need to have a fire going. You didn't need a lot of firewood either, because once you had made a fire, you could use the remains, which looks like fritters, like potato chips. They could use that and kindle the fire with afterwards. So it was a self-firing process. Anyone read Moby Dick by Herman Melville? Classic. You should read that one. Melville in Moby Dick, you've seen the movie, of course, but yeah. Or you read the cartoon Moby Duck, perhaps, but yeah. Now, Melville, he reflects upon that the whale, because you use the remains of the fat to fire the kettle, that it was his own demise. He reflects that it offered the fuel for its own killing. Of course, it's ironic, but today you would call it circular economy. It's very sustainable. Right, wrong button. No, yes, right whale, wrong button. When the oil had been cooled down, you can see here, this is actually pictures from the museum, whaling museum in Red Bay on Labrador. It was cooled down, and then it was very often they used either big trays or even a boat filled with water, and they just oil on top on that. So the impurities would sink to the bottom, the oil floated on top of it, and then they would fill the oil onto casks that were then maneuvered or towed out and stored on the whaling ships. And there were many applications of this product. High quality, almost smell-free if it was produced under low temperatures, processed and put on cask very early, and then exported back to Europe. When it was produced here, most of the impurities were gone, so it was a clean product that was imported into Europe. And it fetched quite high prices, particularly in the beginning, the first decades of whaling, it fetched very high prices. From oil like this, you could make white luxury soap. It was one of the products made by it, but most of this oil was used for lighting. And this is the simplest way of lighting that still is used today. The only thing you need is a tray or a container of oil and a wick. And then you light the wick, and then you have an oil lamp. And that is what most of this was used for. But also for lubrication of when you need that, like you use oil today, or for adding into color production, or for preparing leather and things like that. So that was the use of this product. Later, as we've shown here, they didn't produce the oil on land here on Svalbard. They brought the blubber back to the mainland, and then they produced the oil there. In the Netherlands, those factories that produced oil from blubber that came from Svalbard were called stinkerijen. So you can imagine that it wasn't completely free of smell. I think we break there. If I've pushed the right button, a break will occur. No. Well, I've said this already. There was no commercial market for the whale meat. That doesn't mean that it wasn't that some of the whalers did not take meat back and consumed it itself, but that was not a product. You cannot find it on the sales lists or on the mainland, because it was simply not a commercial product. But now, yes, 15 minutes break. We'll assemble again. So we start again. I'll show you some illustrations here from an old map by Hondius, printed in 1680. Rather naive depiction here, but still very illustrative. And this is yet another example of maps as a historical source. These are decorations on a larger map, but still there are details that tells us a lot how the whaling activity went on. Here you can see down in the right-hand corner the rowing boats, 4 rowers and a harpooner in the bow, getting closer to the whale. This one, well, yeah. This is a Donald Duck whale, I think. It's here you can see in the middle of the picture here you can see the baleen. They're cleaning the baleen and burning them today and taking them into. You also see these. They have tents on the not houses but tents. So this is a rather provisionary camp. Or land station. Typical ships, these square rig ships, floats, they were called in the Netherlands. You can see also tents here. Here are those the coopers. You know what a cooper is? Name Cooper and Butker. They're those who produced casks. You can see they are towing empty casks on land. Most often they would have only the parts of the casks. These are wooden casks, and then they would put them together when they came to Svalbard, not to have empty casks with them. But anyway, that's the business here. This is obviously a male whale. It looks more like a big herring, but yeah. Anyway, here you see a primitive version of this whale oil station. Just a fireplace on land and a copper place there where they could produce the blubber that is carried on shore here by some men. Here you see 4 boats are actually connected together to drag the whale or to tow the whale to a land station, which is rather quite usual. Yeah. Another famous, I hate this screen, but this is from the Rijksmuseum, I think is there. Exaggerated perhaps a bit, but still quite accurate. Here you can see houses on shore, and some of these stations did have buildings, not for year-round operation because they were here for 2 months, perhaps, in the summer, coming in July typically and going back in August. But there would be a land crew on some of those bigger stations. There was a ship's crew and a land crew. The land crew was consumed with production of train oil. So this was the land station. But as I said in the previous half, the whaling industry changed. There was a technology shift, and when they went from land to open sea. And that happened in the 1640s. Now, there were probably numerous reasons why this transition took place. But one thing is that it proved impossible for these two dominating companies, the Nordsjö company, the Dutch one, and the Muscovy company, to keep competition out. In practice, it's very difficult. Svalbard is large, and there were lots of people who wanted a piece of the action. So it was a big pressure, particularly in the Netherlands, a big pressure to open up this cartel. And that happened actually in 1642. The so-called Nordsjö company was dissolved. And the authorities in the Netherlands said that from now on, whaling is open for everyone. Everyone can take part in that. Much to the detriment of the British, of course, who had hoped to keep the monopoly open. Formerly, the Muscovy company continued as a company, but in practice, there were a lot of private interlopers, as they were called, private whaling expeditions that competed with the British Muscovy company. So the monopolies fell away, and it opened up for a great expansion in the activity. And from a level of perhaps 20, 30 whaling ships towards 1640, that number doubled. And other nations, as I said, came too, particularly Germans, Danish, some French whalers as well. This, in turn, of course, meant that some of the hunting grounds near the coast became very crowded. There are fjords and bays and sounds where the whales were, or close to these areas. It became crowded because they were competing about the same whales, and all these rowing boats in one rather small area. Of course, that led to conflict, and it was a race to be the first to strike a whale with a harpoon, because that was the unwritten law that the boat that first got an iron into a harpoon, that is, into a whale, had the right to that whale. First come, first served. So crowded hunting grounds is one factor. Possibly also ice problems. Well, how could ice problems be so acute? Well, we're talking about the mid-17th century. This is what we call the Little Ice Age. On Svalbard, it became, well, in Europe, also the European continent, it became colder. On Svalbard, that meant that the ice edge came further south, and that ice very often filled the fjords and bays of Spitsbergen, West Spitsbergen, which in turn made it very difficult and dangerous to do whaling close to the shore, because the ships and the boats could get trapped, and it's very hard to hunt for whales in between ice floes. So that is also, there are some evidence, not only climatic evidence, but there is also evidence in the form that there are many reports of shipwrecks and during this period of ships going down because it was pressed down by ice or ran into ice. So that could be factors that sort of accelerated the transition to a different way of doing whaling. And hence the so-called pelagic, or rather open sea hunting and processing activity, it developed after the mid-17th century. There's no exact date here because this took time, this transition. But we know from other evidence that from visits to Svalbard and accounts that were written, that in the second half of the 17th century, in the 1670s, for instance, these big land stations were abandoned. There were not people in the land stations anymore. That doesn't mean that some other whalers probably went ashore still for some time to boil train oil, but the majority went out into the drifting ice near the ice edge and hunted for whales there. So the land stations were not longer in use. That meant that, well, in principle, one could process also the blubber on board the ship. Those of you, the ignorant majority of you who haven't read Moby Dick, then you would not have any idea of this, but in fact, they built furnaces on deck of the ship. That was Moby Dick. I'll have to tell you everything, haven't I? Well, Moby Dick was not a Greenland whale. Moby Dick was a big white toothed whale, spermaceti whale. And that is a global species. So they were hunted also in tropic waters, far from land. And these whaling expeditions went on for years, so they couldn't get to land to process the whale meat, the whale oil. So therefore, they had furnaces. They made furnaces on the deck of the ship and boiled the train oil there. That was, of course, extremely dangerous because the oil itself, of course, burns very well. So a spark could, or open flame, and these people were smoking all the time, as we know, and there was an open fire on the furnace. So many of these whaler ships actually burned down to the keel during that. It's known to have been tested also on Svalbard, boiling train oil on board the ships. But very soon the preferred method was to just strip off the blubber, put the blubber onto casks, and then go back to the mainland, go back to Europe, and produce the whale oil there. In Norway, in the small, insignificant town of Bergen on the west coast of Norway, don't know if you heard about it. It's not very important, but they actually they were quite leading in whaling from Norway. So there were no less than 3 such factories in Bergen, in Sandviken in Bergen, that produced whale oil and seal oil. So they got all the bad smell down there. It's gone now, I think, both the smell and the factories. Where were we? Yes, after 1650, this developed, and that also meant that the hunting area expanded enormously. Until the mid-17th century, most of the whalers had congregated around the coast of Svalbard. When this pelagic activity developed and the new technology was introduced, then the hunting grounds stretched from all the way from in principle, the south of Greenland and to Svalbard, the whole northern Atlantic. because the whalers followed the migration route of the Greenland whale. So they could be hunted on their migration way route northwards and back. Very often the whalers would congregate still, and particularly at the end of the season at Svalbard. So at the end of the season, there could be several hundred whaling ships gathered on Svalbard, sailing back in convoys, because these were troubled times in Europe. There were wars in Europe, and private ships were also prey of the pirates. And there's safety in numbers, so therefore they gathered on Svalbard or near Svalbard in some of the fjords, typically in Belsund at the end of the season, and sailed back in convoys. They also went to the shore on Svalbard, on Spitsbergen, to bury their dead. There are many graves, whalers' graves on Svalbard, and there was no tradition of lowering dead bodies into the sea at that time. Dead people should be buried in the ground in proper coffins. So many were buried on land. There are some 1,500 graves on Svalbard. Some of the graveyards are pretty big. Also, perhaps they could hunt some reindeer and get some fresh meat as well at the end of the season, because they were living off dried fish, salt, meat, things like that, which gave them scurvy, of course. I must spend a couple of words on Smerenburg, because you're going to hear about it, and some of you are going to visit it and even perhaps guide other people in Smerenburg. Smerenburg is literally means fat city. Smeer is Dutch for fat or blubber, and Burg is, of course, the town. This is the remains that you see when you come to Smerenburg. There are big myths about how this was a thriving city in the 17th and 18th century, with thousands of people. And some write of, even a normally very sober scientist like Nansen writes fantastic stories about Smerenburg, about there being prostitutes in lively clothes and churches and shops and whatnot. Rubbish. Absolutely rubbish. There's hardly any place that has been so thoroughly studied archaeologically and historically as this area. It's just a strand flat. There was the Dutch expedition that made archaeological excavations over 4 years in this region. They concluded that at a maximum there were 200, 250 people that worked in the summer on land in Smerenburg. So how did this 10,000 people, 10,000 people, where does that come from? Well, it's because if you multiply the number of ships that were engaged in whaling at its most, say 300 ships, and they each had a crew of 40 people, well, that makes 12,000 people. But those people were on board the ships, most of them. Very few, and at that time, when we're talking about 300 whaling ships, the land stations had already been abandoned. So if I ever hear that any one of you tell other people about thousands of people in Smerenburg, I'm going to strangle you. In a manner of speaking. Don't say, for God's sake, that you heard it from me, at least. Right. I promised to say a few words about sealing too. Sealing does not really have a huge place in Svalbard's history. This is also a seal, a big one, called walrus, but it's counted among the seals. Now, as opposed to whales and whaling, there was a huge tradition of catching seals in Europe, in Northern Europe. I mean, seals were and are abundant in the Baltic Sea, around the British Isles, Norwegian coast, Danish coast, and Iceland, and so on and so forth. So seals was not an unfamiliar product. And as I've mentioned a few times now, also walruses. There are occasional walruses even further south in Norway. We have them every second or third year. There is a walrus turns up. But normally they stay in cold water. But since the trade with Russia was in walrus products, the Western Europeans knew very well what a walrus was. And when they heard about walrus resources in the Svalbard area, as I said in the previous half, that was the first resource that was exploited in 1604 on Bear Island. Now, one thing is that talking about walrus, the walruses were either scared away, killed, or were not systematically exploited by these whalers. Occasionally, if the whaling went bad one season, they could hunt for walruses as well to get some products from the season. That was not normal. Sealing is another. Seals is another business. We find this slaughtering place, walrus bones, is actually on Bjørn Island. They're protected, by the way, so you're not allowed to take bones away from such slaughtering places. Seals were sometimes hunted on Svalbard during the 17th century whaling, when the whalers were in these areas. But it did not play an economically important role. Now, the main product was the same, oil. And seals, the big seals, and walrus, of course, are extremely fat, so they could produce oil of good quality from those as well. Yes, sir, we have a question.
You talked about how they did not eat the meat of whales because they were presumed to be a fish. What do they think about the seals?
I don't know. I was very young at the time. I can tell you this, that I believe it was the same thing. It wasn't associated with the same religious problems, the seal. And seal meat must have been eaten, particularly in Northern Europe. I served seal meat in my doctoral dinner, much to the detriment of my Dutch opponent, who was, yeah. Anyway. Well, so they could add on to a bad season of whaling. If they were unlucky and didn't catch any whales or only one whale or so, they could add up to the season's result by killing seals. But there is a problem with sealing in Svalbard. There are few of them, and that has to do with the biology of the seals. The species that you find here on Svalbard is mostly the ringed seal, the small ringed seal. You have to kill an awful lot of small ringed seals to get any products out of that. And you have the large bearded seal, stor kobbe. Of course, but they are single animals. So it's very difficult to hunt them effectively. When we're talking of sealing as an industry, those are other species. That is the hooded seal, klappmus, and the what is called the Greenland's grönlandssel. What's that in English? Harp seal. Thank you. The harp seal. And they are very numerous in other areas of the Northern Atlantic, but not in Svalbard. Hooded seal are very rarely here. Harp seal you can find because they are on they migrate in this area, but then in the open sea and very difficult to catch. So the industrial sealing went on in the west ice and the east ice, and it started in the west ice, which is the area north of Jan Mayen, between Jan Mayen and East Greenland, stretching northwards towards Svalbard. That is the area where both these two species congregate in the spring to reproduce and also to change fur, to molt. That is where you find these congregations of thousands of seals together, where they could be hunted effectively. And that was an activity that developed actually in the late 17th century, and in the 18th century, that became a specialty of some who had previously done whaling. For instance, in the mentioned insignificant town of Bergen, they specialized a lot in sealing in the west ice. They had whaling equipment with them, but they went into the west ice to do sealing instead, to hunt for seals. And that's a bit of a different technology. And because you have to maneuver in thick ice and drifting ice, very dangerous. Needs a lot of competence to navigate in these areas, to find these areas where the seals congregate. So the west ice became important, particularly in the 18th century, and competed with whaling. It never became as numerous. The number of whalers never became as numerous as whalers. But there were a significant number of sealers, and later in the 19th century, that is when the whales were killed, sealing was the big industry in these areas. So hooded seals, harp seals. The technology was very simple, in the sense, or it didn't require a lot of equipment. You needed a ship to get there. And the ships were general ships. Some of them were reinforced to withstand the pressure of ice. But normally these were ships that were used for trading purposes for the rest of the year. So it was a standard ship and a sailing ship. They had small boats as well to go in between the ice floes and onto the ice. But as soon the seals were lying on the fast ice, so they ran on the ice. I'm sure you've seen films and pictures of how this takes place in modern times. In the early period, some of the, and particularly the harp seals, they were clubbed to death, or clubbed unconscious and then killed with a knife. A hooded seal is a bigger species and can, particularly the males, can get very aggressive. So it's difficult to get close enough with a club. They had to be shot. So they used muskets and guns later to shoot the seals. Now, these animals could be exploited for the fat, the meat, but also the skin, which they could produce leather. And a good season, they could, for a sealer going into this region, could perhaps catch 1,000, 1,500 seals. I have compared the results, the economic results of those who did whaling and those who did sealing, and there's not a lot of difference. There's much more variations from one season to another than a variation between whales and seals. So this was largely the same thing. But this activity did not take place in Svalbard. This is the West Island Sound of Svalbard. That's what I just said. What about the ecological results of sealing, the long lines in sealing? Well, this is, as I said, when most of the whales were killed off and the population became extinct in the Northern Atlantic and in the Davis Strait as well. Well, whaling subsided in the mid-19th century. Around 1850, there were very few whales left, but sealing continued. So in that sense, in an economical sense, it was sustainable. Was it also in an ecological sense sustainable? Well, they couldn't be as effective simply because it's so difficult to navigate into the ice, and there were so big amounts of seals in the water. So it wasn't until the 20th century that the seal hunt actually threatened the population. Nowadays, it is almost negligible, the seal hunting that goes on. So they were never near being threatened, these species of seals in the Atlantic Ocean. It was stopped for other reasons than for the stocks being treated, as opposed to whaling. So, if we see this in context with the questions we asked in the beginning of the lecture, how was this whaling and sealing in the long perspective? Whaling actually had a high status, or it created for itself a high status. It was as one contemporary writer put it, whaling is the school in which heroes are made. So it had a certain nimbus about it, whaling. But if you do compare the economic results with other kinds of activity, commercial trading vessels, fisheries and so on, there isn't really much difference. There was a period where whaling was extremely valuable for the owners and the investors. But that was in the 17th century, let's say the first 3, 4, 5 decades, first half of the 17th century. It was an activity that gave high returns. But when the competition grew, there were lots of actors in the market, a lot of supply. Of course, the prices fell. And also when it became more difficult to catch whales because of the taxing of the population, then there would often be a bad season for a whaler. And it was calculated that they could suffer 2 or 3 bad seasons for 1 good season. So in the long run, you had to calculate the rentability in 3 or 4 years. It must have been a surplus, otherwise people would have gotten out of the business at all. But it wasn't as golden as it was portrayed in the beginning of the activity. So in some sense, it was a lottery. It's often called a capitalist industry, and that is interesting because nobody knew the word capitalism in those days. And industry, we're talking about the pre-industrial era. We're not talking about industry in the modern sense, but it has some likenesses to modern industry. For the capitalist part of it, many of these ships were actually organized as shareholding companies. You could buy shares in a whaling ship or a whaling expedition, rather. They were open shares on the open market, and you could trade in those shares. And what you did was you invested in a part of a whaling expedition, and then you got a part of the result. But you also took the risk of that expedition. So let's say you put money into this, and it was a successful journey. Then you would get a return that was equal to the share that you had bought in this venture. But you also took the risk. So this was to finance these whaling expeditions. That was very expensive. You had to have the ship, of course. It had a large crew, 4 times as large as a normal ship, 40 people on board, as opposed to 10, 12 on a normal trading ship. All those people should have their wages. You ever had to buy provisions, whether you caught whales or not. People had to eat, and you had provisions for 2 months, 2 or 3 months. That cost money upfront. You had to get that capital. And that is why these whaling expeditions were organized as shareholding companies. It wasn't unheard of also in other kinds of trading missions, for instance. So that was a way of organizing it. Some specialized in whaling. Some merchants specialized in whaling and formed companies that actually had whaling as their main activity. Whereas others, well, they were engaged in trade, they were engaged in fisheries, they were engaged in whaling, sealing as well. So it has, and also the fact that when this activity was dependent upon having production facilities to produce the oil, so they built factories. Left behind factories or remains of factories here on Svalbard, and later also there were factories on the mainland. Sometimes these factories were organized as firms that delivered services or sold their services to the whalers. So they weren't owned by the whalers; they were individual companies. So there are lots of factors that you compare with modern capitalist production in a pre-industrial phase. So what about the other impacts of this, the political and cultural implications of this? Well, whaling put jurisdiction over Svalbard area at a question, with a question mark. We'll come back to that in a special lecture about the political history. But I mentioned this in the previous half, the first half of the lecture. I mentioned this, that the whaling in those days, in the mercantilist politics, as it was called at that time, the resources were thought to be belonging to a king. So, for instance, the British king claimed sovereignty over Svalbard, over Spitsbergen, as it was called, to exclude others. So was it possible to claim sovereignty over this area? The Dutch, of course, protested. The Danish Norwegian king, Christian IV, protested, claiming that he had sovereignty over the areas. So for the first time in the beginning of the 1600s, the question of who owns Svalbard, as it were, was put on the agenda. And as I said, we're going to come back to that. So there was a question of that. Another effect of the whaling industry, of course, was that Svalbard, this area, I call it Svalbard, although it was known as Svalbard at that time, but this area became integrated in the known world, as it were. So many thousands of people visited Svalbard, of course, so people of Europe got to know about this region. That doesn't mean that everybody was equally well informed, but there were accounts being written about the whaling expeditions. There were literature about it. There were maps published. So it was sort of drawn into the known world. It wasn't terra incognita anymore. It was becoming a part of the known world. That's important. Yes, sir. Question here.
The people, the workers that went on these ships, on the expeditions, was it like a high status for them to go work on these ships? Or was it more like the lower class that was sent up there to work for the rich?
Oh, good question. There were, I repeat the question in case the other listeners, was it high status connected to working on whaling ships? Well, some had very high status. Harpooneers, commanders of whalers, whaling skippers and sealing skippers with special competence. Those who were called with the Dutch word the spiksnaders, those who cut the blubber, experts, they were well paid. But there was a hierarchy, of course. There were ordinary sailors who got just a little part of the they get some pay up front, but they also get a part of the catch. So these high status, the commanders, the skippers, the navigators, the harpooneers, they had high status. But what is interesting, and I hear from your language that you're Danish or from Actually, the so-called North Frisian Islands, Sylt, Rømø, they became the experts of Europe in the later period, like the Basques were in the initial phase. Then, from these islands, Sylt, Rømø in particular, came these specialists. The skippers, the commanders, the navigators, the harpooneers, they specialized in that. And they sold their services to the Dutch fleet, to the British fleet, particularly to the German, Danish, Norwegian fleet. And they manned those ships. I have a list of crew from this small town, Bergen, about whom I wrote my doctoral thesis. And half of the crew, or perhaps, approximately half of the crew came from these islands, Sylt, Rømø. So these, if you go there, I haven't been there, but I've seen pictures. There's a lot of evidence from this whaling period. You can find, in gardens, you find whalebone portals in the gardens of these islands, and they still have a consciousness about their great past. Great past, or present past, So, some of them had high status. As I said, whaling is the school in which heroes are made. That was a Danish writer who wrote that. Ecological consequences, interesting. As I've touched upon, maybe in an ecological sense, the whaling was sustainable before 1640, before this big expansion. Now, we can only guess about this because we don't know the initial size of the whale population here. There are different estimates. The IUWC, the Whaling Commission, had one estimate. The later estimate says that perhaps 50,000 initial stock. But we know that in total, more than 100,000 whales were killed on Svalbard during the the face here. But the number of whales that were killed until 1640 was comparatively low, perhaps 100 whales a year. So the population at that time, until that time when harvested, must have sustained that hunting pressure. But when the hunting expanded and went to a pelagic phase out in the northern Atlantic, it must have been unsustainable. And we know that sometime in the beginning of the 19th century, this hunting or this population crashed. Around 1850, there were hardly any whales left, and consequently no whalers left. What I don't know anything about, but something that you can ponder about over a glass of hot milk, is what kind of ecological side effects do we have? You take the top predator out of the marine environment. It eats thousands of tons of fish and crustaceans and things in the sea. And then you take this predator out of the marine system. What happens to the rest of the marine system? Must have been quite important effects. Fish, seals, polar bears, the carcasses that were left rotting on the beaches. Yeah, just imagine. But we're moving to a close. This is the bigger picture, the smaller picture of the bigger picture. Now you see what it is. Clay pipe. Hundreds of such pipe fragments are found on Svalbard. They were smoking incessantly. And considering the stench that was in this business, no wonder. But they smoked clay pipe, and you can see in the skeletons, the teeth, you find big holes in the teeth because these clay pipes grinded the teeth. So they must have smoked all the time. These are also sources because they can be dated. There are time series built on the different types and marks and stamps of these clay pipes. So they can be used for dating as well. Interesting. This is not a recommendation of starting smoking, rather to stop smoking if you do smoke. Next time on the History of Svalbard, this is a man's world, hunters and trappers on Svalbard. I will hopefully see most of you tomorrow, but this evening's lecture is over. So I wish you a very pleasant evening. Thank you.
Thank you.